Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St.Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome to another episode, a special one this time, of Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic. The president who had promised an end of forever wars has greenlit strikes against Iran. Since February 28th, Iran is under US and Israeli attack. Ayatollah Khamenei was among the first of the Irani leadership to be killed. President Trump has called on the Iranian people to, quote, take back their country, and has promised the operation to be concluded within 5 weeks. How do the strikes fit into the security strategy as it had been outlined by the Trump administration? How does Trump's war against Iran put, quote, America first and fit into MAGA ideology? And can we make out a Trump doctrine after all? In this episode, we are trying to dissect these questions with St.Gallen security policy expert and professor of international relations, James Davis. Welcome to the podcast, James.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It was long overdue, and I wish we had a more, let's say, pleasant occasion to talk, but, well, the nature of your business is often war. So this has been, I don't want to say a great opportunity to bring you on, but it has been very opportune to bring you on today. James, you've been a fixture for HSG students in international affairs since 2005, when you left the Ludwig-Maximilian-Universität to take on St. Gallen's chair in international relations. You're originally from Michigan, where you also obtained your undergraduate degree from Michigan State before you moved on for your graduate work and your PhD to Columbia in New York. You've held various positions, too many to name, but you've been at the most prestigious research institutions in your field. You've received numerous awards, including, most importantly for us, the 2011 Credit Suisse Award for Best Teaching, awarded by our student union. And in your work, you try to bridge research and practice, as you've recently demonstrated by co-initiating the European Nuclear Study Group. And you've very recently also been to the Munich Security Conference. To what extent was Iran already on your mind when you were in Munich?
Yeah, I've been watching the build-up, of course, for some weeks now, and it seemed to me that when the president announced that he was sending a second carrier group to the region, that this was the signal both to Iran, but also interested observers that the president and his administration were serious about putting some pressure on Iran. And the only reason I say that is because it's very expensive to send carrier battle groups around the world. And it's hard to just keep them parked somewhere for a long time. And so the longer that went on, the more convinced I was that the chance of some kind of a strike was going up. So I was thinking about this already at Munich, and actually in discussions with some, in particular, German politicians and decision makers. That was a topic of concern, right? Do you think Trump means it? And I said, I think you don't spend that kind of time and money unless you mean something.
Only a week ago, Trump held a State of the Union address, and he said essentially nothing about his intentions in Iran. He also didn't really mention what had earlier rattled the world, namely the decapitating strike against Venezuela and the arrest of President Maduro. Now again, the world seems to have been shaken out of a stupor and been caught at surprise. And many are debating to what extent the strikes against Iran, the earlier intervention in Venezuela, fit into what Trump promised his voters and how that fits into an America First strategy. You have taught several generations of HSG students American grand strategy. We don't want to call this a grand strategy, but to what extent do you see a strategy behind the actions of Trump's administration?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that I think concerns me or interests me the most in the last few months. And I'm torn. I sometimes think we may be mistaken to believe that there is a strategy. And so we need to think about a series of isolated events that happen, have their own logic. And then in retrospect, we try to kind of connect the dots. You can connect the dots that are randomly sprayed against a wall and create all kinds of different pictures with them. But there was never anything there to begin with. It's just something we impose on it. So that's one way of thinking about it, or that there is some kind of a strategy here. And that's something that I've been concerned with, and also trying to read what others are saying about this. You know, there's sort of two things that seem to be going on. One is there does seem to be something of a recalibration of U.S. commitments abroad and a withdrawal from anything that looks like what people in Europe like to call the rules-based international order. And that's a kind of a recalibration that says, you know, Europe should pretty much be able to take care of itself. It's 400 and some million people. It's got a pretty big economy. Why are we subsidizing European defense? And we have other concerns. We need to worry more about balancing China than we do about defending Europe. So there's this kind of recalibration going on. And at the same time, this kind of rejection of anything that looks like an institutional framework for dealing with security problems. The U.S. never completely bought into the system that it built itself.
Yeah.
But certainly this administration sees institutions and rules more as constraints than opportunities for promoting U.S. interests and values abroad. And so the strikes against Venezuela, the strikes against Iran, sort of show the belief that you can use military force unconstrained by the concerns of allies or institutions in ways that will help promote U.S. interests. That seems to be clear. But how does any of that fit into the part of America First that was all about we're not going to be involved in the world, we're going to concentrate on the economy, we're going to get out of the business of trying to restructure foreign states the way we would like them to be, nation building, democracy promotion, all that costs a lot of money, costs a lot of lives. We don't have a very good record for trying. And it's hard to see how this fits into that side of what the administration has been saying it's all about, other than that so far it's been relatively limited. We don't have boots on the ground, as they like to say.
Yeah.
And so it's different from some of those earlier efforts to do regime change and nation building. But the question is a good one. And why doesn't he talk about Venezuela or Iran in the State of the Union? I think because at least some of his advisors are telling him, hey, we're going into an election year and we promised to fix the economy and people don't think it's fixed. And so that's what we need to be talking about more than talking about these foreign adventures, which are kind of hard to reconcile with what you said we were going to be doing.
I mean, some are saying, well, he's entering now a war of choice, a war that will last much longer than the very short intervention in Venezuela. Others are saying, well, this has already been a forever war. It has been dragging out for 4 decades, practically. We've always been, though in a Cold War, but we've been at war with Iran. Do you think that reasoning has been leading the administration, or is it more maybe that we see a renaissance of a type of new and neoconservatism within the administration that has been able to get the president's ear? Yeah,
that you're asking the question that I've been thinking about, right? Is what we're watching being driven by some external logic? There are a couple choices out there. One is perhaps the case that the attacks on the Iranian nuclear program in June of 2025 were not as devastating as the president said they were. His own intelligence services originally thought they weren't that devastating, and that there was an ongoing threat that Iran would reconstitute its nuclear program. It was making progress on other fronts as well, further developing its ballistic missile capacities, becoming quite a producer of drones, such that it's exporting them to other countries, in particular Russia, that's using them in the war against Ukraine. And so, this is kind of tidying up what we didn't finish back in June. And what we finished in June was, or tried to finish in June, was a nuclear program that's been a thorn in the side of many American administrations, and all the attempts to get the Iranians to turn away didn't fail. That would be the narrative they'd give you. I'd give you perhaps a different one, but that's the narrative they'd give you. That would be one way of thinking of it. So it's finishing a never war, as you put it. Another part of that story is the regional story, which is Iran has been a thorn in the side of American allies in the region. It exports instability through its proxies around the region, and both the Israelis and the Saudis are fed up with the revolutionary regime. And both, it appears, at least this is the reporting you can get in the New York Times, both were pushing hard for this strike. So doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. was pushed into something it didn't want to do, but at least there were people in the region who supported something that the Americans might have been thinking about doing for their own reasons. So that's one way of thinking about it. But then we get all this talk of regime change and all this talk of helping the Iranian people to get the democracy or whatever the hell it is they want, the more representative government that they are calling for in mass protests that were brutally suppressed, right? It looks like upwards of 30,000 people killed on the streets a few weeks ago. And that's where, you have to say to yourself, well, that certainly is not part of what Make America First Again foreign policy was about. That is kind of an echo of the neoconservative moment in the Republican Party, where it was about, liberalism with teeth, promoting a liberal notion of not only world order, but domestic order, and being willing to back that preferred order with the might of America's military. That has not been a very successful foreign policy strategy so far. There's not too much you can point to that you would be proud of in that respect. But it certainly, has echoes of that. And then both of those, right? Both this kind of world policeman ending never war with a country that wants nuclear weapons and promoter of democracy around the world. Both of those sit uncomfortably with at least that strand of MAGA republicanism that's all about isolationism and withdrawal to America and focusing on basically writing our own house economically. So you wonder how any of this really coheres if you were to think about it from the standpoint of a strategy, which is where your question started, right? To what degree is this a grand strategy? It's hard to really see that in what's going on. And then on top of that, just to make one last point, on top of that, we have the national security strategy that was published in December of last year, which really doesn't talk about any of this stuff at all, right? It talks a lot about Western hemispheric stuff. I guess one could think of the Venezuela intervention in those terms, but certainly Iran is not sort of part of that kind of Donroe doctrine is what they were calling it.
Yes, and it was also a lot focused on severing tie or weakening the ties across the Atlantic, and really this refocus towards the great competitor China. So the Middle East didn't have the central role in the national security strategy. I know this is speculative, but if you had to bet your money on a reason why the president chose to go on war against Iran, what do you think is the likeliest explanation? Because you have now outlined several reasons that we could see, but what do you think is the likeliest?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a resultant of a variety of arguments that he was hearing. And, there were more than one reason to do it. And I think he's a guy who's willing to just roll the dice and see what happens. He was, pretty enamored with the results of the Venezuela intervention and probably is fairly puffed up by that. And nobody's giving him a very strong case about what the potential downsides are. And so, he rolls the dice. And, at some level, I find that, I don't know if I find it appealing, but I find it worthy of recognition. Let's put it that way. Because sometimes, if you are willing to roll the dice, you can get outcomes that you otherwise wouldn't. But by the same token, this is a guy that's gone bankrupt many times. So he's rolled the dice and won, but he's also rolled the dice many times and lost. And the losers would not just be him politically, but the losers would be all those American men and women who would lose their lives or pay the bill.
And the Iranians who might not see the results coming that have been promised by the president, or the potential that he has promised.
That's right. I mean, it's, I say by rolling the dice, you may create a space that people could take advantage of and get to a place that was otherwise impossible to get to. That said, I think it's unlikely. It seems to me unlikely that the Revolutionary Guards, which are not just a military and police force, but a kind of economic juggernaut in Iran, it's an enterprise. They're in all different aspects of the Iranian economy. Why would you want to give up your political power and your source of economic wealth without a fight? Why would you do that? So I don't see the Revolutionary Guard somehow putting down their weapons as President Trump asked them to do and joining the opposition in favor of a new regime. I just don't see it. And if that's the case, if the incentive for them is to continue to fight, remember they have the weapons. It's about almost 200,000 members of this Revolutionary Guard, another close to 1 million soldiers that could be mobilized. The opposition figures have no weapons. So I find it hard to imagine that somehow this is going to end quickly and in the way that the president seems to imagine when he's thinking positively about what could come out of this.
To the extent that he has actually shared what the plan forward is, he has said, well, this will last roughly 4 to 5 weeks. We will not put boots on the ground. This will just through air attacks. But the question is, what if that is not enough? And what if, nothing really changes in the aftermath? Do you see America agreeing to another, I don't want to say another Iraq, but again, an operation on that scale? Do you see that as a possibility? I know I'm being speculative again with this question, but I'm wondering from your perspective as someone who has observed American security policy for so long.
Yeah, I mean, possible, yes. Likely, no. If for no other reason that we have elections coming up in the fall. The opposition party will do what opposition parties do, that is oppose. And within the coalition, I still find it a strange coalition that we call MAGA. The coalition comprises a number of people who are against exactly this kind of a thing. So I just don't see Trump waking up one day and saying, boy, to kind of bring this to a positive end, it would make sense for us to get involved on the ground or in a deeper way in the inner workings of Iran. What I do see, though, is something that looks like a civil war in Iran. You would have a severely weakened regime, but not completely defeated regime. Severely weakened means perhaps some armed resistance could emerge. And then you get a messy internal fight that starts to look like Iraq, but Iraq without the Americans.
You've already mentioned the way that Iran and Russia are entangled. What do you see as the consequences for Russia and China in the wake of this conflict?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think we have to view the war in Ukraine through the lens of now the war in in Iran, to the extent that the Americans and Israelis are able to destroy the weapons production facilities in Iran, that's going to weaken the Russians over time. To the extent that the Chinese see an America willing to use force to prohibit or to prevent outcomes that it thinks are worse, they, at least under this administration, should be hesitant about any kind of adventurism toward Taiwan. Depending on what happens on the ground in Iran, they may also come to the conclusion that you don't want to get in a fight with the Americans and then give your own opposition forces a chance to go out on the street and to topple your regime. I don't think that's the most likely outcome in Iran, but, it's possible. And Xi Jinping must be thinking about, how good is this regime able to keep the lid on opposition, and what does that tell me about my likely success? So I think there are a lot of reasons why Russia and China should be watching what's going on and thinking about what it means for them and the continuation of the kind of axis or alliance that they obviously have had for the last decade or so.
I found this very interesting that you're saying that China will be watching closely as it will think about the implications if it ventured, across the Formosa Strait. Because some have been arguing that China will benefit from what is going on in Iran in terms of its international standing, and also it might benefit from the fact that America might be seeing its forces bound in the conflict in Iran for a longer time. But you don't seem to think that is a likely scenario. Or am I misinterpreting?
No, I mean, so it cuts both ways, right? On the one hand, the fact that the United States and its European allies have been resupplying Ukraine for 4 years now means that they already were facing diminished stockpiles of important weapons. And the American military has been sounding the alarm now for about a year that there are low stockpiles of some important weapons. And now we're shooting a lot of those at the Iranians, which means that those numbers are going down again. That obviously should be, resound to the benefit of both the Russians, because those are weapons we can't deliver to the Ukrainians, but also to the Chinese. So on that sense, I think it helps China. On the other hand, though, I think some of this suggests that China should be cautious. America has been able to operate with impunity in the airspace of Iran. We've heard some suggestions that new weapons are being used for the first time that are proving to be extremely effective. We don't know yet what those are, but people are talking about them. To the extent that the Americans can show that their technology still is a generation or two beyond what others have, that could lead Xi Jinping to think twice. And the other part of this, I like to think of these things together, right? We see the United States, when it's willing to engage, is able to do so in a way that is, allows them to act almost with impunity through technological prowess and domination. And when we look at Ukraine, we see that Ukrainian nationalism has led to a situation where the Russians have been able to make only minimal gains on the battlefield over the last couple of years. If I were Xi Jinping, I would think, okay, nationalism is still a potent force. Taiwanese nationalism is there. He would like it not to be, but it is. Putin did not want to believe there was such a thing as Ukrainian nationalism. He's learned a lesson. If Xi Jinping is smart, he's learning the lesson that you don't define somebody else's identity. They define their identity. And all the indications are that there is a strong Taiwanese national identity. Nationalism combined with high-tech weapons makes it hard to conquer a place. So that's the lesson I would take away if I were Xi Jinping. And that cuts a little bit in a different direction from the part of the story. Well, boy, the United States has really drawn down its weapons. It's weakened and it's distracted. So I think it's both, and it's anybody's guess which of which of those two is more dominant in Xi Jinping's thinking at any particular moment.
We've touched on Russia, China. We've, of course, focused on the region itself, but where does that leave Europe? What role do you see for Europe in this particular conflict? Is there a role even?
Yeah, I mean, once again, Europe is sort of on the sidelines of something that's happening very close to its own borders. It's not really playing a role. It's chosen not to play a role in this conflict with Iran. And I think I understand why that's the case. It has both political, economic, and international legal reservations about what the United States is up to. It's clearly not in keeping with international law. It further destabilizes a region that is important for Europe because of energy supplies, and further destabilizes a region that has been the source of large groups of refugees that are destabilizing European countries from within. So I get it. I understand why Europe is sort of hesitant to get involved in this. That said, it is your backyard. It is Europe's backyard. And so Europe cannot be indifferent to what happens. And one would hope that to the extent that the Trump administration doesn't have a plan for the day after, the Europeans start to think about how to step in and help create a plan for the day after. It's often the case that the U.S. bombs and the Europeans rebuild. That's not a very comfortable position to be in, and perhaps Europe can come up with something more clever than just being the group that pays the bill at the end. But they certainly should be thinking about what comes afterward.
That's a very important point, and one that hasn't been addressed very often. What do you see as aspects of this conflict now that hasn't been addressed enough? What is outside of our perspective right now that we should actually keep an eye on?
Well, I always think about, not only the day after, but, a couple of years after. So, let's imagine that the regime in Tehran is toppled and something more appealing to the West and more importantly, more appealing to the Iranian people comes about. What does that mean for the politics of the region? And I don't know, but I do think to the extent that the Saudis have wanted to get rid of the regime, they may find that the world that emerges is a world in which they have less influence. Right now, the Saudis can, or let's put it this way, the Americans need the Saudis as an important partner for power projection in that part of the world, as an important partner for economic reasons. If Iran is an alternative, well, then the Americans can play games with Saudi Arabia that they couldn't play before. By the same token, another great power that's not isolated the way the Mullah regime has been isolated and is allowed to play the game of international politics and not only the game of terror politics, creates new opportunities for shifting alliances and balance of power politics in the region that we wouldn't have today. So we know the Turks have been interested in getting back in the game of Middle East politics in a way that they haven't been able to for some decades. If you have the Turks wanting to expand influence, you have the Saudis wanting to maintain their preeminence, a preeminence that's been challenged by some of the other regional players, the Qataris and the Emiratis. So then you have now a group in Tehran that is no longer seen as a pariah, but a potential ally. I don't know what that looks like, but it's certainly an interesting thought experiment to begin to spin out scenarios. And also then, of course, what that kind of regional balance of power would mean for the larger game, U.S.-China. So I think, it's probably too early to be thinking about that for policymakers, but I think people in the intelligence services or people in the universities can certainly be be playing those thought experiments.
That's great invitation for the listeners among us who are still at university and might have been looking for ideas as to what to do next. Thank you so much, James, for broadening our perspective on the conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. For those of our listeners who'd like to learn more, what do you recommend? What should they listen? What should they read or watch?
So, right now I've been following the ongoing debate in the journal Foreign Affairs for the last 3 or 4 issues, which is both trying to understand the Trump administration's foreign policy as well as put forward some kind of a reasonable foreign policy. That both from the standpoint of those that are in the opposition, but also I think some sympathetic people that are trying to give Trump and his foreign policy more coherence than it has. And so I would recommend anybody that's interested in these sorts of topics to have a look at the essays that have been published in the last 6 to 8 months in Foreign Affairs. It's fascinating to see smart people trying to make sense of a world that is so much in flux and led by some very erratic leaders that none of us feel completely confident we understand. And maybe through that debate, we're able to at least get some orientation that helps us to move forward.
Thank you so much, James, for helping us make sense of the current situation and seeing the broader picture here. Also, venturing a bit along speculative paths for thought games, thought experiments that we might need to play in the very near future. Thank you for making time for Grüezi Amerika.
Thank you, Claudia, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to all our listeners. And with that, we wish you Auf Wiedersehen.
Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St.Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler.